Montana Territory, 1868. A time when dreams could turn to dust faster than the blink of an eye. When hope and horror traveled the same trails across the untamed frontier. For the Emerson family, the Montana wilderness represented possibility. A chance to claim land under the Homestead Act and build a life away from the crowded tenements of Boston. 10-year-old Margaret Emerson had spent nearly 4 months watching the landscape transform from verdant eastern forests to sweeping plains, and finally to the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. The Hollister wagon train, 28 settlers bound by shared dreams and desperate courage, had welcomed the Emersons despite their last-minute addition to the party. No one could have foreseen the blood and fire that awaited them in the shadow of those majestic mountains. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost silvered the tall grass surrounding their campsite as Margaret gathered kindling along the perimeter. Dawn had barely broken, the sky transitioning from charcoal to pearl grey, promising another clear autumn day. The wagons stood in their customary circle, a fragile barrier against the wilderness beyond. Most travelers remained asleep, except for old Mr. Hollister himself, who had taken the final watch of the night. Margaret's small hands moved methodically, gathering dry twigs for the breakfast fire. Her mind wandered to the corn husk doll her father had promised to help her make for her younger brother's birthday. Little Thomas would be turning 4 tomorrow, and despite months of difficult travel, their mother had saved a small jar of molasses to mark the occasion. Such simple joys seemed monumental after the hardships they'd endured on the trail. "Should be enough kindling there, Maggie," Mr. Hollister called softly, his weathered face crinkling with warmth. "Your mama will be needing it soon to start the morning meal." Margaret nodded, gathering her bundle. At 10 years old, she took pride in contributing to the daily work of survival. 4 months on the trail had transformed her from a city child into someone who understood the rhythm of frontier life, the constant labor, the rewards of self-reliance, the quiet moments of beauty amid hardship. The first gunshot shattered that. Rhythm like a stone through glass, Margaret instinctively dropped to the ground, the kindling scattering from her arms. More shots followed, then screams, high, terrified wails that sent ice through her small body. Through the tall grass, she could see riders charging into the circle of wagons, at least 15 men with bandanas pulled over their faces firing indiscriminately into the camp. Mr. Hollister's warning shout was cut short by a bullet, the old guide collapsing near the main campfire, his rifle unfired beside him. The Blackwood family scrambled from their wagon, Mr. Blackwood pushing his wife and 2 children toward a small stream behind them. A rider spotted them, wheeled his horse around, and cut them down before they made it 20 yards. Their bodies crumpled in a terrible heap, nightclothes stained crimson in the strengthening dawn light. Margaret pressed herself flat against the earth, one hand covering her mouth to stifle her sobs. She was 40 yards from the nearest wagon, concealed in the high grass that bordered their campsite. The massacre unfolded with horrific clarity. Mrs. Wilson dragged screaming from her wagon, the Parker boys gunned down as they tried to reach their father's rifle, an infant wailing until its cries were suddenly, sickeningly silenced. The raiders moved methodically, killing first, then looting. They took only what was valuable and easily transported: money, jewelry, weapons. They didn't bother with food stores or personal effects. This wasn't desperation, it was calculated predation. "Check the perimeter," a deep voice commanded. "Make sure we got them all." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She inched backward through the grass, moving with painful slowness away from camp. The morning dew soaked through her clothes, the earth's chill seeping into her bones. 20 yards. 40. The sounds of destruction continued behind her. When she judged herself far enough away, Margaret risked rising to a crouch. The grass stood taller than her bent form, providing cover as she navigated toward a stand of pines that lined the creek. Each step was agony, her small body shaking so violently she feared the trembling might give away her position. A horse whinnied. Uncomfortably close, Margaret froze. "Nothing over here, Webber," a voice called, no more than 15 yards from where she stood, immobilized with terror. "Get back here, then. We're burning the wagons." Margaret remained motionless until the hoofbeats receded, then continued her painstaking retreat toward the trees. By the time she reached the pines, black smoke billowed into the morning sky. The raiders had set fire to the wagons, erasing evidence of their specific crimes, though not the broader atrocity. From the relative safety of the trees, Margaret watched as the murderers mounted up and rode southwest, their saddlebags heavy with stolen valuables. Only when they disappeared over a distant ridge did she allow herself to collapse against a tree trunk, her small body convulsing with silent sobs. Hours passed before she found the courage to return to what remained of the camp. The wagons still smoldered, reduced to blackened frames and ash. Bodies lay where they had fallen, their vacant eyes staring skyward. Margaret moved among them like a ghost, searching desperately for her family. She found her father first, fallen near their wagon with his hunting knife still clutched in his hands. He had managed to wound at least one attacker, based on the blood trail that led away from his body. Her mother lay nearby, her body curved, protectively around Thomas, her little brother's wooden toy soldier still clutched in his tiny hand. Their stillness told Margaret everything her 10-year-old mind didn't want to accept. In a haze of shock, she gathered what supplies she could. Salvage, a canteen half full of water, her father's hunting knife, a singed blanket, and a small tin of matches from the chuck wagon. She couldn't bring herself to take anything else from the dead. The vastness of her predicament settled over her as she stood amid the devastation. She was alone, a child in hostile territory, at least 70 miles from the nearest settlement. Winter came early to these mountains. If the elements didn't kill her, starvation would, or perhaps the raiders would return to ensure no witnesses remained. Yet beneath the crushing weight of circumstance, something hardened in young Margaret. Emerson. Her father's words from the previous night echoed in her mind. "Remember, Maggie girl, Emerson's don't surrender. We face our troubles and push through." With the meager supplies bundled into the blanket, Margaret studied her surroundings. The Hollister train had been following the Jefferson River northward, planning to connect with a larger trail that would take them west to their land claims. Logic dictated she should continue north toward the outpost at Fort Ellis, but the raiders had ridden southwest. North would be the first place they'd look if they suspected a survivor. Margaret turned her face eastward toward the mountains. Her father had pointed them out days earlier, the Tobacco Root Range, with peaks that caught the morning sun like jagged teeth. Rough country, he'd said, but full of game and hidden valleys. Something about those mountains called to her now. Not just the promise of concealment, but of height. From those peaks, she might see for miles, might spot approaching danger before it found her. She took a final look at the charred remains of the camp, silently promising her family that she would survive to tell of what happened here. Then, with the sun high overhead, Margaret turned her face eastward and began to walk. The first day passed in a fog of shock and physical strain. Margaret forced herself to move at a steady pace, rationing sips from the canteen, gathering service berries, where she found them growing alongside animal trails. As dusk approached, she sought shelter beneath an outcropping of rock, wrapping herself in the salvaged blanket against the mountain night's chill. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by nightmares of the morning's horror and the very real. Sounds of wildlife moving in the darkness beyond her shallow cave. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries echoing off the mountainsides. Dawn brought no comfort, only the stark reality of another day of survival. Margaret's feet, encased in sturdy but worn boots, developed painful blisters that burst and reformed with each mile. Her small pack, made from the blanket, grew heavier as the day progressed, though it contained almost nothing. The meager rations she had salvaged would last perhaps another day, if carefully measured, yet she pressed on, following game trails upward, counting each step as a small victory against death. By the third day, Margaret's situation had grown dire. The canteen held only a few precious swallows, though the mountain streams provided abundant water when she could safely reach their banks. Food was the greater concern. She had finished the last of her salvaged supplies that morning and had found little to forage along the day's journey. Hunger gnawed at her insides, making her steps unsteady and her thoughts increasingly muddled. The weather, too, had turned against her. Dark clouds gathered over the mountains, bringing an unseasonable cold front down from the north. The first raindrops hit as Margaret struggled up a rock-strewn slope. Within minutes, the drizzle became a downpour. Her clothes, already tattered from days of wilderness travel, offered little protection against the deluge. The blanket wrapped. Around her shoulders grew sodden and heavy. Her hair hung in dripping tendrils around her face, and her teeth chattered uncontrollably. "Keep moving," she commanded herself. "Just keep moving." But toward what? The question haunted her with increasing urgency. Fort Ellis remained days away, perhaps a week at her current pace. In her weakened state, with dwindling resources and worsening weather, the odds of reaching it diminished with each passing hour. As afternoon faded toward evening, the rain finally relented, though the skies remained threatening. Margaret found herself on a high ridge overlooking a deeply carved valley. The terrain ahead appeared increasingly steep and broken, less hospitable than the slopes she had already traversed. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Margaret gripped a boulder, waiting for it to pass. When it didn't, when in fact it intensified, a new fear took hold. Her vision began to blur at the edges. The distant mountains seemed to waver and dance. When the spell subsided slightly, Margaret raised her head and studied the broken landscape ahead. Continuing blindly forward no longer seemed possible. She needed shelter, a place to recover her strength before the coming night brought even colder temperatures. It was then that she noticed the narrow opening in the ridgeline just 50 yards ahead, a dark shadow against the grey stone that suggested a cave or at least a deep overhang. With renewed purpose, she forced her trembling legs to carry her forward. The opening proved to be the entrance to a small cave, no more than 15 feet deep, but blessedly dry. The floor was sandy with scattered stones, the ceiling high enough for her to stand upright. Most importantly, the entrance was partially screened by a stunted pine, making it all but invisible from more than a few yards away. Margaret collapsed inside, her strength completely spent. The soggy blanket offered meager protection against the cave's chill, but at least she was out of the wind and rain. She curled into herself, shivering uncontrollably, her mind clouding with the combined effects of exhaustion, hunger, and fear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Just for tonight," she whispered to herself. "Just rest tonight and keep moving tomorrow." But as darkness claimed the mountain and the temperature plummeted further, a new realization formed in her exhausted mind. This cave offered something she desperately needed, not just shelter for a night, but security. From its recessed entrance, she could see approaching danger without being seen. The forest below provided both concealment and potential food sources. A small stream gurgled just 30 yards downslope, offering clean water. Perhaps, she thought as consciousness began to fade, the wisest path wasn't to keep moving blindly forward, but to secure a defensible position, to build strength, to survive. Long enough for help to arrive, or for the raiders to abandon their search, assuming they even suspected a survivor. "I'll stay," she murmured, the decision crystallizing as sleep overtook her. "Just until I'm stronger. Just until it's safe." She couldn't know, as consciousness fled, that this simple decision, born of desperation and childish logic, would shape the coming months in ways she could never have imagined, that her temporary refuge would become a prison of fear and isolation, that the cave on the mountainside would both preserve her life and slowly erode her humanity, or that after months of solitude, her fate would rest in the hands of a stranger whose own life had been shaped by similar violence, a Cheyenne scout, with reasons of his own to hunt the men who had destroyed everything Margaret Emerson had ever known. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. Margaret's temporary shelter had become a permanent refuge against the increasingly harsh winter. Her initial panic had transformed into a rigid routine of survival that sustained her body, while her spirit retreated deeper into itself. The cave now bore the markings of extended habitation. A crude door of woven pine boughs covered the entrance, keeping out the worst of the mountain wind. Inside, a bed of dried grasses and pine needles occupied the deepest recess. A small fire pit sat near the entrance, positioned so that the smoke would drift outward rather than filling the cave. Stacks of firewood lined one wall, while roots, dried berries, and strips of smoked meat hung from a makeshift rack fashioned from stripped branches. December had brought heavy snow to the Tobacco Root Mountains, blanketing the landscape in treacherous beauty. The white expanse made travel nearly impossible, but it also granted Margaret an unexpected gift, the ability to spot tracks around her sanctuary. Each morning, she carefully swept away any sign of her presence and studied the area for prints that weren't her own. So far, only deer, rabbits, and the occasional mountain lion had passed near her hiding place. Of the raiders, there had been no sign since that first terrible day. Margaret had changed in ways both visible and hidden. Her once soft hands had grown, calloused from gathering firewood and crafting primitive tools. Her face, once round with childhood softness, had thinned, revealing cheekbones that mirrored her late mother's. Her clothing, patched with strips of rabbit fur and pine bark fiber, hung loosely on her frame despite her efforts to maintain her strength. The most profound changes, however, lay beneath the surface. The talkative, curious girl who had left Boston with wide-eyed excitement had receded into watchful silence. Even alone, she rarely spoke aloud, as if her voice itself might betray her location. Her movements had acquired a predator's stealth, her ears attuned to the subtlest sounds of the forest. She had become a creature of the wilderness, more comfortable with the company of squirrels and jays than with memories of human interaction. Today marked the beginning of February, or so Margaret calculated by the notches carved in a stick beside her bed. 3 full moons had passed since the massacre, 3 months of solitude, of walking the knife edge between survival and surrender. The morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Margaret's breath hung visible in the air inside her cave as she carefully banked the embers of her small night fire. Winter had depleted her stores faster than anticipated, and today she would need to venture farther than usual to check her snares and gather what meager food the frozen forest might offer. She pulled on layers of clothing, her original dress, now reinforced with fur linings, covered by a crude poncho made from the salvaged blanket. Her feet were wrapped in rabbit skins inside her increasingly fragile boots. Her father's hunting knife hung at her waist, its blade worn from constant use but still serviceable. From a leather thong around her neck hung a small wooden soldier, her brother's toy, the only personal item she had allowed herself to keep. Margaret stepped from the cave into the brilliant morning, momentarily blinded by sunlight reflecting off fresh snow. She secured the pine bough door behind her, then carefully began to obscure her tracks as she moved down slope toward her nearest snares. The first two traps were empty, the third disturbed by some larger predator that had stolen her catch. Fourth, set in a sheltered hollow where tender shoots still pushed through the snow, held a small rabbit. Margaret whispered a word of thanks as she freed the animal from the snare and swiftly ended its suffering. The rabbit was thin, but its meat would sustain her for 2 days at least, and its fur would repair the increasingly worn lining of her mitts. She was checking her fifth and final trap when she noticed something that froze her blood, a set of tracks that didn't belong to any animal she recognized. Human tracks, boot prints, and they were fresh, cut clearly into the morning's new snow. Margaret dropped to a crouch behind a fallen log, her heart hammering against her ribs. For long minutes, she remained motionless, scanning the forest with the intensity of prey, sensing a predator. The forest maintained its winter stillness, giving no sign of the intruder's presence or direction. The tracks led toward the stream where she gathered water, then continued upstream toward the neighboring valley. They weren't the military style, boots worn by the raiders, but rather the distinctive imprint of moccasins with hardened soles, the footwear of someone who walked the mountains regularly, someone familiar with the terrain, a trapper perhaps, or a native scout. Neither possibility offered comfort. Trappers were often rough men who lived beyond the reach of law, while relations between settlers and native tribes remained tense throughout the territory. Anyone finding a white child alone in these mountains would ask questions she couldn't safely answer. Margaret backed away from the tracks, abandoning her final trap unchecked. She moved with painful caution, taking a circuitous route back to her cave, doubling back multiple times. To ensure she wasn't followed, she paused frequently to listen, straining her ears for any sound that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the forest. By the time she reached her sanctuary, the winter sun had passed its zenith. She slipped inside, securing the door more thoroughly than usual, then retreated to the deepest shadows of the cave. Her hands trembled as she skinned the rabbit, her mind racing with newfound fear. 3 months of vigilance and now this. It couldn't be a coincidence. Someone was searching these mountains deliberately. That night, Margaret didn't light her fire despite the biting cold. She wrapped herself in every layer of clothing and fur she possessed and huddled in darkness, listening to the wind moan through the pines outside. Sleep evaded her entirely, her mind conjuring scenarios each more terrifying than the last. The next morning brought heavy clouds and the promise of more snow. Margaret ventured out only far enough to confirm that no fresh tracks surrounded her cave, then retreated inside to wait out the coming storm. The snowfall began mid-morning, a gentle curtain that gradually transformed into driving sheets of white. By evening, nearly a foot of fresh powder had accumulated, effectively erasing all signs of human passage from the mountainside. For 3 days, the storm raged, delivering the heaviest snowfall Margaret had experienced since seeking refuge in the mountains. When the skies finally cleared, the landscape had been transformed into an alien terrain of deep drifts and buried landmarks. Moving through this new topography would be exhausting and dangerous, but it also granted a temporary reprieve from discovery. No one, regardless of their tracking skill, could follow her now buried trail. Nevertheless, Margaret redoubled her precautions. She ventured from the cave only when absolutely necessary, abandoned her more distant snares, and gathered water from a small seep inside a rock crevice rather than visiting the stream. She maintained her vigilance, studying the area around her shelter each morning and evening for any sign of intrusion. For 2 weeks, she detected nothing unusual. The boot prints remained buried beneath layers of snow and ice, and no new tracks appeared in the vicinity of her shelter. Gradually, Margaret began to extend her movements again, driven by the increasing scarcity of food in her immediate surroundings. It was during one such foray, nearly 3 weeks after spotting the mysterious tracks, that disaster struck. Margaret had ventured to a south-facing slope where early spring thaw had exposed patches of ground, and the first tender shoots of new growth pushed through the soil. She was gathering these precious greens, her attention focused downward, when a sound stopped her heart, the unmistakable snap of a twig beneath a heavy foot. Margaret froze, her fingers still wrapped around a handful of shoots. Slowly, without moving her head, she shifted her gaze upward, scanning the forest in the direction of the sound. At first, she saw nothing but trees and lingering patches of snow. Then a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the pines, a tall figure standing utterly motionless, watching her with the stillness of a mountain lion assessing its prey. The figure was clearly a man, broad-shouldered and imposing, despite the distance between them. He wore buckskins and a fur-lined jacket, with hair that hung in two long braids, adorned with what appeared to be small beads or feathers. His copper skin and distinctive clothing identified him immediately as one of the native people who had inhabited these mountains long before white settlers arrived. Their eyes met across 50 yards of forest floor. Margaret's instinct screamed at her to run, but experience had taught her the futility of flight. She wouldn't outpace an adult hunter on his home terrain. Instead, she slowly rose to her full height, her father's hunting knife now gripped in her right hand, her eyes never leaving the watcher's face. For a long moment, neither moved. They remained locked in mutual assessment, prey and predator, survivor and discoverer, child and adult. Yet something in the man's posture suggested he was as surprised by the encounter as she was. "I mean no harm, young one," the man called. In accented but clear English, his deep voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "You are far from safety here." Margaret remained silent, her knife held before her in what she knew was a pathetic defense. Her eyes darted briefly to the surrounding forest, calculating possible escape routes. "There are worse dangers in these mountains than me," the man continued, making no move to approach her. "I have tracked your movements for many days. You hide. Well, for a white child, but winter is harsh, and you grow weaker." "Leave me alone," Margaret finally responded, her voice rough from disuse, barely above a whisper. "I don't need help." A trace of something, perhaps amusement, perhaps respect, flickered across the man's stoic features. "Your snares are empty, your clothing thins. Spring comes slowly to high country." He gestured toward the eastern horizon. "Storm approaches, 3 days of snow and wind. Alone, you may not survive it." As if summoned by his words, Margaret noticed the dark bank of clouds building in the distance. Another storm system, perhaps even more severe than the last. Her food stores were critically low, her firewood nearly depleted. She had planned to spend the day gathering both. The stranger seemed to read her thoughts. "I make camp in the valley below. Food, fire, shelter." He paused, then added with surprising gentleness, "No questions asked until you wish to speak to them." "Why would you help me?" Margaret demanded, her voice stronger now, edged with the suspicion that had kept her alive for months. "I have lost a daughter," the man replied simply. "You have lost a father. Perhaps the Great Spirit brings us together for a purpose." The statement struck Margaret with unexpected force. How did he know about her father? Had he somehow visited the massacre site? Or was it simply a logical assumption about a child alone in the wilderness? Before she could respond, a distant sound reached them both, the faint but distinctive crack of a rifle shot echoing across the valley from the western slopes. The man's head turned sharply toward the noise, his body tensing visibly. "Bad men hunt these mountains," he said, his voice lower, more urgent. "Men who wear one face but show another. Men who kill without honor." He looked back at Margaret, his dark eyes intense. Same men who attacked wagons, perhaps. A cold that had nothing to do with the winter air seeped into Margaret's bones. The raiders. They had returned to the territory. "How do you know about that?" she asked, her knife hand trembling slightly. Found burnt wagons months ago. Found bodies. His expression revealed a controlled anger. Found tracks of men who dress as Cheyenne, but are not Cheyenne. Margaret's mind raced. If the stranger had found the massacre site, he knew far more about her than she had realized. Yet he had made no attempt to capture or harm her during the weeks he had apparently been tracking her movements. "Who are you?" she finally asked. "I am called Running Wolf," he answered. "Scout for Northern Cheyenne, hunter of bad men." He paused, then added with grim determination, "Hunter of men who killed my brother's family and blame Cheyenne for the deed." Another rifle shot sounded, closer this time, followed by a third. Not hunting shots. They came too close together, too deliberately spaced. Someone was signaling across the valley. Running Wolf's expression hardened. They sweep the mountains, looking for something, or someone. His gaze fixed on Margaret with new intensity. "You saw their faces. You are a witness to their crime." The realization struck Margaret with terrible clarity. The raiders weren't simply passing through the territory again. They were hunting her. Perhaps they had counted bodies at the massacre site and found one missing. Perhaps they had discovered signs of her escape. Whatever the reason, they were methodically searching the mountains, and the approaching storm would soon force her from the relative safety of her cave as food and firewood ran out. Running Wolf seemed to read the shifting calculations on her face. "Choose quickly, young one," he said. "Storm comes, hunters come. I offer protection but cannot wait long." Margaret's world narrowed to this impossible choice. Trust this stranger from a people she had been taught to fear, or face both the killers and the storm alone. The knife in her hand suddenly seemed pitifully inadequate against either threat. "How do I know you're not with them?" she demanded, a final desperate question. Running Wolf's expression shifted subtly, revealing a depth of pain that resonated with her own. "Men who killed your family killed mine also," he said simply. "Used blue soldier uniforms when they attacked our hunting camp. Wore feathers and paint when they attacked white wagons. Create war between peoples who might otherwise live in peace." He slowly extended his open hand, palm upward, a universal gesture of offering. "I hunt for justice, not children. Come or stay, your choice. But choose now." A fourth rifle shot cracked through the forest, close enough to send birds scattering from nearby trees. The decision crystallized in Margaret's mind with sudden clarity. After months of isolation, months of trusting nothing but her own instincts, she recognized the truth in Running Wolf's words, in his eyes that carried the same haunted shadows she saw in her own reflection. She took a single step forward, then paused. "If you betray me," she said with quiet intensity, "I'll kill you in your sleep." For the first time, a genuine smile crossed Running Wolf's weathered face. "Strong spirit," he commented with approval. "Good. You will need it for what lies ahead." As the dark storm clouds gathered on the horizon and the distant sounds of the searching party grew closer, Margaret Emerson took her first tentative steps toward the Cheyenne scout. With each step, she left behind a piece of the solitary creature she had become and moved toward an uncertain alliance that would challenge everything she had been taught to believe about the frontier, about native peoples, and about her own capacity for courage. Neither could know, as they disappeared into the forest depths, that their unlikely partnership would eventually unravel a conspiracy that stretched from the highest levels of territorial government to the blood-stained hands of men who profited from hatred between peoples, or that the witness and the warrior, bound by shared tragedy, would become the unlikely architects of a justice both had abandoned hope of ever finding. The journey to Running Wolf's camp tested Margaret's endurance beyond anything she had faced during her months of solitary survival. They traveled in tense silence, moving with deliberate care through the forest to avoid leaving obvious signs of their passage. The Cheyenne scout set a demanding pace, occasionally pausing to listen or to obscure their tracks, but never slowing. For Margaret's benefit, pride kept her from complaining. After surviving alone for so long, she refused to appear weak before this stranger who had disrupted her isolation. Despite her determination, the strain showed in her labored breathing and increasingly unsteady steps as the afternoon stretched on. After 2 hours of relentless movement downslope, Running Wolf finally halted at the edge of a narrow ravine. He studied Margaret's exhausted form with an appraising gaze. "Rest," he said simply, gesturing to a moss-covered log. Margaret sank onto it gratefully, though she maintained her vigilance, keeping the hunting knife visible in her lap. Running Wolf ignored the implied threat, kneeling instead to examine her makeshift footwear with unexpected concern. "White man's boots are not made for mountains," he observed, noting how the rabbit fur wrappings had worn through in several places, exposing blisters and raw skin beneath. "Need proper moccasins." From his pack, he produced strips of softened deer hide and a small pot of strong-smelling salve. Without asking permission, he began applying the medicine to her feet. Margaret tensed at the contact, but allowed it, recognizing the practical necessity. "Bear fat and pine pitch," Running Wolf explained as he worked. "Helps healing, keeps infection away." His unexpected gentleness confused Margaret. The newspapers in Boston had portrayed Indians as savages lacking civilized sensibilities. Yet here was this warrior, treating her wounds with the careful attention her mother might have shown. "Why did you come alone?" she asked, breaking her self-imposed silence. "Wouldn't your people help hunt these raiders?" Running Wolf's hands paused momentarily. "Some things must be proven before spoken," he replied. "My chief is wise but cautious. White men who speak against other white men are often not believed. Indian who accuses whites of wearing feathers to blame Cheyenne." He shrugged eloquently. "Even less likely to be believed," Margaret finished. "Need evidence, need a witness." His dark eyes met hers with surprising intensity. "Need truth that even the territorial governor cannot ignore." The implication was clear. Margaret was not simply a child he had found in the wilderness, but potentially a valuable ally in his quest for justice. The realization should have frightened her, yet it carried a strange comfort. For months, her survival had seemed pointless, disconnected from any larger purpose. Now, her continued existence might serve as testament to a truth others sought to bury. As Running Wolf finished wrapping her feet in the deer-hide strips, a question formed in Margaret's mind, one that had haunted her since their first encounter. "How long were you watching me before you showed yourself?" A hint of respect flickered across his stoic features. 12 days. Found your cave shelter during the last big snow. Tracked your movements. Studied your patterns." He secured the wrapping with a practiced knot. "You survive well for a child, better than many grown men." Margaret wasn't sure whether to feel violated or flattered by his surveillance. "You could have approached earlier." "Trust must be earned," he replied simply. "Needed. To know if you run to raiders or from them." He rose to his feet, gathering his pack. "Rest done, we move now." They continued downward through increasingly dense forest, the mountain air warming slightly as they descended into a sheltered valley. Margaret noticed how Running Wolf moved, not with the crashing directness of white hunters she had observed, but with a fluid efficiency that seemed almost part of the forest itself. He taught without words, his movements demonstrating the proper way to place feet, to use terrain for concealment, to listen to the forest's warnings. Despite her exhaustion and lingering suspicion, Margaret found herself absorbing these lessons, admiring the skill with which he navigated the wilderness. When he suddenly raised his hand in a signal to stop, she froze instantly, her senses alert for danger. Running Wolf pointed to a nearby thicket where a young deer browsed, unaware of their presence. In a single, fluid motion, he nocked an arrow to his bow and drew it back. The arrow flew true, taking the deer through the heart. It collapsed without a sound, its death as efficient and merciful as possible. "Food," Running Wolf stated, moving toward the fallen animal. "And warmer clothing for you." He approached the deer with reverence, kneeling beside it to whisper words in his native tongue before beginning the butchering process. Margaret watched, transfixed by the ritual that transformed the act of killing from mere necessity into something. Approaching ceremony. "What did you say to it?" she asked. "Thanked its spirit for giving life so we might live," he replied, his knife moving with practiced precision. "Asked forgiveness for taking what was not freely offered." He glanced up at her. "Your people do not thank the animals they kill?" The question carried no judgment, merely curiosity, yet Margaret felt a strange discomfort. "My father always said a prayer before we ate," she offered, thanking God for providing. Running Wolf nodded. Different words, same meaning. He worked in silence for several minutes before adding, "All people must eat. All people must kill to live. How we honor what dies for us shows what kind of people we are." The simple philosophy resonated with Margaret in ways she hadn't expected. For months, she had killed rabbits and squirrels to survive, feeling nothing beyond grim necessity. The idea that those deaths deserved acknowledgement, even reverence, offered a strange comfort. By the time Running Wolf had dressed the deer, salvaging every usable part, the afternoon light had begun to fade. He packed the meat efficiently, then gestured for Margaret to continue following. "Camp close now," he assured her. Before dark, their destination proved to be a natural hollow in the mountainside, invisible until they were almost upon it. Narrow opening between rock faces led to a sheltered basin barely 30 feet across. A small lean-to of branches and hides stood against the far wall, with a fire pit positioned where smoke would disperse through a natural chimney in the rock. "Winter camp," Running Wolf explained. "Hidden from unfriendly eyes." The hollow offered perfect concealment while providing protection from the elements, similar to Margaret's cave, but clearly chosen with a warrior's eye for defensibility. A single sentry positioned at the narrow entrance could guard against any approach. Running Wolf busied himself preparing a fire while Margaret took stock of her surroundings. The camp showed signs of extended habitation, a stack of dried firewood, a crude drying rack for meat, even animal hides stretched for tanning. Yet it held no personal items, no decorative touches that might reveal something of its occupant's character. "You live alone?" she asked as he coaxed flames from tinder. "For now," he replied. "My people camp 3 days' journey west. Will return. When justice is found," he glanced at her, "or when snow melts from high passes, whichever comes first." As the fire grew stronger, spreading welcome warmth throughout the hollow, Running Wolf skewered strips of venison on green sticks and positioned them over the flames. The rich aroma of cooking meat filled the air, causing Margaret's stomach to clench painfully. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten anything so substantial. They ate in silence, Margaret forcing herself to take small, measured bites despite her hunger. Running Wolf watched her with quiet approval, recognizing the discipline of someone who had learned to ration scarce resources. When they had finished eating, he produced a water skin and a handful of dried berries, a simple dessert that tasted like extravagance to Margaret's deprived palate. Only then, with hunger satisfied and the fire casting dancing shadows against the rock walls, did Running Wolf finally ask the question she had been dreading. "Now, young one," he said, his deep voice gentle but firm, "tell me what you saw when bad men came, The request broke something inside her. For months, Margaret had carried the memory of the massacre locked away, unspoken, a weight she bore alone in the silence of her cave. Now faced with a direct invitation to release that burden, words poured from her in a torrent of grief and horror. She described everything: the early morning attack, the methodical slaughter, her concealment in the tall grass, the clear view she had of the raiders removing native disguises afterward. She remembered specific phrases they had used, including names: Preston, Miller, and their leader, a man called Weber with a distinctive scar across his jaw. Running Wolf listened without interruption, his face revealing little beyond intense concentration. When Margaret finally fell silent, emotionally drained by the recounting, he nodded once. "Same men," he confirmed grimly. "Same methods, same leader." He rose and moved to a small pack secured beneath a rock overhang. From it, he withdrew a piece of paper, a wanted poster, weathered and creased from repeated handling. He passed it to Margaret. "James Weber," Running Wolf said as she examined the crude illustration that did indeed show a man with a scarred jaw. "Former Army scout, now leads men who attack both white settlements and Indian hunting parties, takes gold, furs, horses, leaves bodies and blame." The poster offered a substantial reward for Weber's capture, dead or alive, but had been issued nearly 2 years earlier. The territorial authorities clearly hadn't succeeded in apprehending him. "He killed your family?" Margaret asked. Running Wolf's expression darkened. "My brother's family, 5 moons ago. Hunting camp near Medicine Bow Mountains." His hands tightened into fists. Men dressed as blue-coat soldiers shot children first so they would not escape, took horses, weapons, winter furs. His control slipped momentarily, revealing the raw grief beneath. "Found my brother last, still alive. Told me the truth before joining my ancestors. Said attackers spoke to each other as white men do, not as soldiers. One called another by name, Weber." Margaret absorbed this information, connecting it with her own experience. "They want whites and natives to blame each other," she said slowly, voicing the realization, "while they profit from both." "Smart girl," Running Wolf acknowledged. "Easier to steal, to kill, when people look in wrong direction." He stared into the fire, his voice dropping lower. "Territorial governor sends soldiers to punish Cheyenne for attacks we did not make. White settlers fear and hate us for violence done by men like Weber wearing false feathers." The political implications were beyond Margaret's full comprehension, but she understood enough. The murders she had witnessed were part of something larger, a deliberate strategy to incite conflict between settlers and native tribes. "Will anyone believe us?" she asked quietly. "A Cheyenne warrior and a child?" Running Wolf's gaze returned to her, assessing. "Truth has power," he said simply, "but needs evidence, needs witness who can speak to both worlds." He studied her with new intensity. "You walk between worlds now, Margaret Emerson. Not fully. Of white settlements anymore. Not of Cheyenne people, something new." The use of her full name startled her. She hadn't introduced herself. Reading her surprise, Running Wolf explained, "Found a small book in your father's pocket when I buried your family. Had names written inside. Thomas, Helen, Samuel, and Margaret Emerson." His expression softened slightly. "Kept book safe. Will return to you when the time is right." The knowledge that her father's Bible, the family record with all their births carefully inscribed in his neat handwriting, had been preserved sent unexpected warmth through Margaret's chest. Something tangible remained of her former life, even as that life receded further into memory with each passing day. "Weber's men are still hunting," she said, returning to more immediate concerns. "They were getting closer to my cave." "Running." Wolf nodded. "They search methodically, ridge by ridge, valley by valley." He added more wood to the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. "Storm will slow them for 3 days, maybe 4. After that, must be ready." "Ready for what?" To hunt. The hunters, he said simply, to gather evidence that cannot be denied, to find justice for both our families. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. I'm just a child. What can I do against armed men? Not all strength is in the arm that holds a weapon, Running Wolf replied. Sometimes the strongest power is in the eyes that soar, the memory that holds, the voice that speaks truth when others listen. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. You survived alone in the mountains for 3 moons, found food, shelter, warmth when grown men would have died. Such strength is rare, even among my people. His assessment, delivered without flattery or condescension, penetrated the defensive walls Margaret had built around herself. For months, she had defined herself solely by what she had lost. Now, this warrior from a people she had been taught to fear was defining her by what she had achieved, by the strength she had demonstrated rather than the weakness she felt. I'm afraid, she admitted, the confession barely audible above the crackling fire. Good, Running Wolf replied, surprising her. Fear keeps warriors alive when courage alone would lead to death. He removed a stone pendant from around his neck and held it out to her. My father gave this to me when I first rode to war, said it would protect me if my heart remained true. The pendant was simple, a flat riverstone polished to a gentle sheen, with markings etched into its surface that Margaret couldn't decipher. Yet the offering clearly carried profound significance. I can't take this, she protested. Not giving, Running Wolf clarified, lending until our hunt is done. He placed the cord around her neck, the stone settling against her chest with surprising warmth. Medicine stone holds the power of truth, makes lies fall away, shows a clear path when many trails cross. Margaret touched the pendant hesitantly, uncertain whether to believe in such things, yet unwilling to dismiss the sincerity behind the gesture. Thank you, she said simply. Running Wolf nodded once, satisfied, then rose to check the security of their shelter before settling back beside the fire. Sleep now, he instructed. Tomorrow, begin teaching you Cheyenne ways of moving, of seeing, of hunting, not to make you Cheyenne. Too late for that. A glimmer of amusement touched his eyes. But to help you survive what comes. As Margaret curled beside the fire, wrapped in a rabbit fur blanket Running Wolf had provided, she realized something had shifted during their conversation. The man she had feared just hours earlier had become, if not yet a friend, then at least an ally with whom she shared a common purpose. The isolation that had defined her existence for months had been broken, replaced by a tentative partnership born of shared loss and mutual need. She fingered the stone pendant as sleep approached, wondering what her father would think of her unlikely alliance with a Cheyenne warrior. Samuel Emerson had always been more open-minded than most settlers, cautioning his children against believing every frontier tale about savage Indians. He had taught them to judge individuals by their actions, not by the fears and prejudices of others. By that measure, Running Wolf had proven himself worthy of at least provisional trust. Whether that trust would be enough to sustain them through the dangerous days ahead remained to be seen. As consciousness faded, Margaret's last thought was a startling realization. For the first time since the massacre, she had spent hours without constantly looking over her shoulder, without jumping. At every sound, tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of the fragile alliance forming between them. But tonight, in the shelter of Running Wolf's hidden camp, Margaret Emerson slept more soundly than she had in months, the stone pendant warm against her skin like a promise of protection in a world that had offered precious little of it. Dawn arrived with the promised storm, transforming the mountain landscape into a blinding chaos of wind-driven snow. Margaret woke to find Running Wolf already active, melting snow for drinking water and preparing a breakfast of dried meat and pine needle tea. The hollow's natural configuration sheltered them from the worst of the blizzard, allowing a small fire that would have been impossible in more exposed terrain. Storm good for us, bad for them, Running Wolf observed, handing Margaret a wooden cup of steaming tea. "Gives time to prepare." The preparation began immediately after their sparse meal. Despite the weather, Running Wolf insisted they use the enforced confinement for what he called teaching the eyes to see and the hands to speak. The first lesson involved moving silently across the hollow without disturbing a series of small sticks he had arranged on the ground, an exercise in stealth that proved far more difficult than Margaret had anticipated. "Balance like fox." "Running," Wolf instructed, demonstrating the careful foot placement that distributed weight gradually rather than all at once. "See with your whole body, not just your eyes." For hours, they practiced this fundamental skill, with Running Wolf correcting Margaret's technique with patient persistence. When she finally crossed the hollow without disturbing a single stick, his approval came as a simple nod that somehow carried more significance than effusive praise might have. The lessons continued throughout the day: how to move with the terrain rather than against it, how to use natural features for concealment, how to recognize the subtle signs that indicated recent human passage. By evening, Margaret's muscles ached from the unaccustomed movements, but her mind felt sharper, more attuned to details she would previously have overlooked. As they shared another meal of venison strips and foraged roots, Running Wolf assessed her progress with characteristic directness. "You learn quickly," he acknowledged. "Good eyes, good hands, but still move like white person. Too much hurry, too little patience." Margaret accepted the criticism without defensiveness. 3 months alone in the wilderness had stripped away many civilized pretenses, including false pride. "How long did it take you to learn these skills?" she asked. A rare smile touched Running Wolf's lips. "Still learning," he admitted. "Every day, the land teaches those willing to listen." He added more wood to their fire. "Cheyenne children begin learning forest ways when they first walk. By your age, already skilled hunters and trackers." The revelation surprised Margaret. Among white settlers, children her age were considered too young for serious responsibilities beyond basic chores. Yet Running Wolf spoke of 10-year-old Cheyenne children as capable contributors to their community's survival. "Tell me about your people," she requested, genuinely curious. "Not what white people say about them, but what you would want me to know." Running Wolf studied her thoughtfully, as if weighing how much to share. "Cheyenne are many bands, many families," he began slowly. "Once lived far east in woods and lakes, pushed west by other tribes, then by white settlement. Now live on plains and mountains, follow buffalo herds, hunt elk and deer in the high country." His voice carried a subtle pride as he continued. "Known as strong warriors, but also as people who value honor, truth-speaking, generosity to those in need." He described a complex society with elaborate social structures, warrior societies that maintained order, spiritual leaders who preserved sacred traditions, councils of elders who made decisions affecting the entire tribe. Far from the primitive savages portrayed in penny dreadfuls and sensationalist newspapers, the Cheyenne emerged in his account as a sophisticated people, adapting to rapidly changing circumstances while striving to maintain their core values. "Most important teaching," Running Wolf emphasized, "is that all life is connected. Earth, sky, animals, people, all one circle. What harms one part harms all." "Is that why you thanked the deer?" Margaret asked, recalling his prayer over the animal he had killed. He nodded. "Take life only with respect, only with need, otherwise balance breaks." His expression darkened. "Men like Weber take without need, kill without respect, break balance everywhere they go." The mention of Weber shifted their conversation from cultural exchange to strategic planning. Using a stick to draw in the dirt floor, Running Wolf mapped the surrounding territory, indicating likely routes Weber's men would use once the storm passed. 3 main trails cross these mountains, he explained, marking each on his crude map. Raiders must use one to reach eastern settlements before. Spring thaw brings soldiers back to territory. How many men do they have? Margaret asked, studying the map. 8, maybe 10, Running Wolf estimated. Lost some in attacks on settlements. Gained others who prefer stealing to working. He pointed to a narrow pass between 2 peaks. Here is where they must cross. No other path for horses when snow-deep, so we wait for them there. Running Wolf shook his head. Too dangerous. Need a plan that does not put you in their path. He considered for a moment. Need evidence first. Proof that links Weber to both attacks, on your wagon train and on Cheyenne hunting camp. What kind of proof would be enough? Margaret wondered, unsure what could possibly connect the 2 separate massacres. Something only raiders would have, Running Wolf replied. Something from both attacks that shows the same men responsible. He tapped the map thoughtfully. Weber keeps camp in an old mining settlement 3 valleys west. Raiders gather there between attacks to divide spoils. Margaret's eyes widened. You know where they're based? Why haven't you attacked them there? 1 warrior against many guns. Running Wolf raised an eyebrow. Not brave. Foolish. Scouts have watched the place from a distance. Raiders keep guard day and night. Too many for one man to fight alone. The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. Running Wolf had been waiting for an opportunity, and Margaret's testimony might provide it. Yet sending a child anywhere near Weber's stronghold seemed unconscionable. I want to help, Margaret said firmly, sensing his hesitation. They killed my family. I have a right to be part of bringing them to justice. Running Wolf studied her with newfound respect. Brave words, he acknowledged, but brave words alone do not defeat rifles. He added another mark to his map. Need help from those with authority. Need those who can be arrested, who can testify in white man's courts. The army, Margaret suggested. There's a fort north of here, isn't there? Fort Ellis, Running Wolf confirmed. 2 days' journey in good weather, longer in snow. His expression revealed deep skepticism. Army rarely believes in Indians, may think you are bewitched by a savage kidnapper. The assessment was harsh but realistic. Relations between native tribes and military authorities remained fraught with misunderstanding and prejudice. Even with Margaret's testimony, convincing the army to act against white men based on a Cheyenne warrior's accusations would be difficult at best. What about the territorial marshal? Margaret suggested. My father said the marshals answer to federal judges, not local authorities. Running Wolf considered this alternative. Marshal Hansen rides a circuit through mining towns, he said slowly. Fair man, from what I hear. Arrested white men for crimes against Indians before. He nodded, decision made. After the storm passes, we find a way to reach Hansen before he leaves the territory. The plan took shape gradually over the next 2 days as the blizzard continued its assault on the mountains. Between training sessions that grew increasingly demanding, they developed a strategy that balanced safety with their need for justice. Rather than confronting Weber's men directly, they would gather evidence of the raiders' crimes, then seek out Marshal Hansen, who was reportedly investigating a series of robberies in Helena. On the 3rd day, the storm finally abated, leaving the landscape transformed under several feet of fresh snow. Running Wolf emerged from their shelter shortly after dawn, surveying the pristine white expanse with a tracker's eye. No movement yet, he reported upon returning. Snow is too deep. For horses, raiders will wait at least 1 day for paths to clear enough to travel. He began gathering supplies into a pack. Good time to move toward their camp, watch from a distance. Margaret had been dreading this moment, the transition from relative safety to deliberate proximity to danger. Yet the alternative remaining, hidden while Weber's men continued their campaign of violence, was unacceptable. She had not survived the massacre and months of solitary struggle merely to hide while others determined her fate. "I'm ready," she said with more confidence than she felt, gathering the few possessions she had accumulated during her stay with Running Wolf. A small hunting knife he had given her, a pair of properly made moccasins that replaced her improvised footwear, and a rabbit fur-lined jacket that offered significantly more protection than her tattered dress. Running Wolf assessed her critically, then reached into his pack and withdrew a small leather pouch. From it he produced dark ochre, charcoal, and bear grease. With practiced hands, he began applying these to Margaret's face in patterns that disrupted her naturally pale complexion. "War paint?" she asked hesitantly. "Not war paint," he corrected. "Hunting paint. Helps eyes not see what is there." He worked methodically, transforming her appearance with strategic applications of the natural pigments. "White skin catches eye in the forest. This makes you part of the shadows." When he finished, he held up a polished piece of metal that served as a crude mirror. Margaret barely recognized herself. The face that looked back at her was neither white nor native, but something else entirely, a creature of the wilderness, eyes intense beneath darkened brows, cheekbones accentuated by strategic shadows. "Remember," Running Wolf instructed as they prepared to depart, "we watch only, no confrontation. Evidence, then find Hansen." They traveled west, moving with the careful deliberation Running Wolf had drilled into Margaret during their days of training. The fresh snow made progress, difficult, but offered the advantage of clearly revealing any other traveler's passage. By midday they had covered perhaps 5 miles, working their way gradually toward a ridge that overlooked the valley, where Weber reportedly maintained his base. As they paused to rest in a sheltered grove of pines, a distant sound reached them, the distinctive crack of an axe against wood echoing across the valley. Raiders clearing fallen trees from trail, Running Wolf surmised, his expression sharpening. Preparing to move soon, they altered their course slightly, approaching the sound with extreme caution. 2 hours of careful stalking brought them to a vantage point above a narrow mountain trail where 3 men worked to clear a massive pine that had fallen across the path. From their elevated position, partially concealed behind a rock outcropping, Margaret and Running Wolf observed the activity below. "Weber's men?" Margaret whispered. Running Wolf nodded grimly. "Seaman with red beard," he indicated the largest of the 3. "At the Cheyenne Massacre, called Miller by others." Margaret studied the man, committing his features to memory. "He wasn't at our wagon train," she said. "At least I don't remember him." "Different groups, same leader," Running Wolf explained. "Weber sends some men north, some south, covers more territory." They watched as the men continued their labor, their conversation occasionally carrying up to the hidden observers. Much of it was mundane complaints about the weather and the work, but one exchange captured their attention completely. "Weber wants us ready to move by morning," the red-bearded man called Miller announced. "Says the army's pulling out of Fort Ellis for the season. Once they're gone, we'll hit the Jenkins settlement south of Bozeman." "Another Indian attack?" one of the other men asked with a coarse laugh. Miller spat into the snow. "Nah, this one's different. Weber's got a deal with some territorial officials. We make it look like angry settlers retaliating for the wagon train massacre. Officials get what they want, more reason to push the Cheyenne onto reservations. We get what we want, nobody looking too hard at who's really behind it." The casual confirmation of their suspicions sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with the winter air. This wasn't merely opportunistic banditry, but a coordinated strategy involving corrupt officials. The implications stretched far beyond the immediate threat to either settlers or Cheyenne. Running Wolf's expression had hardened into a mask of controlled fury. His hand tightened on his knife, and for a moment Margaret feared he might abandon their plan of observation for immediate vengeance. She touched his arm gently, reminding him of their larger purpose. After a tense moment, he nodded, acknowledging the wisdom of restraint. They remained in their hidden position until the men finished clearing the path and departed toward what must be their main camp. Only then did Running Wolf and Margaret retreat to a more secure location to discuss what they had learned. "Bigger than we thought," Running Wolf said grimly as they settled in a sheltered hollow nearly a mile from the trail. "Not just raiders, government men are involved too." Margaret struggled to process the implications. Why would territorial officials work with men like Weber? "Land," Running Wolf replied simply. "Always about land. Cheyenne hunting grounds rich with gold, good for cattle. Treaties protect some areas, but if Cheyenne is blamed for attacks on settlers, the army would force them onto reservations," Margaret finished, understanding dawning. "And the land would be open for mining and ranching." Running Wolf nodded. "Simple plan. Weber attacks settlers, blames Cheyenne. Attacks Cheyenne, blames settlers. Officials claim need for protection on both sides. Everyone moves to where the government wants them. Everyone except the people who died," Margaret added bitterly. "Need more than what we heard," Running Wolf decided after a moment of thought. "Words alone are not enough. Need something that connects Weber to both massacres." He studied the terrain thoughtfully. Their main camp close now, maybe 2 miles west in an abandoned mining town. Margaret felt a flicker of apprehension. "You're thinking of going into their camp?" "Not I," Running Wolf corrected. "We, but not the center of camp, edge only, where they keep horses and supplies." He outlined a daring but potentially feasible plan. Using the cover of darkness, they would approach Weber's headquarters and search the outbuildings for anything that might serve as concrete evidence of the raiders' dual identity. The risk was substantial, but so was the potential reward. If they could obtain proof linking Weber to both massacres, perhaps distinctive items stolen from both the wagon train and the Cheyenne hunting camp, they would have something tangible to present to Marshal Hanson. As dusk approached, they moved closer to the abandoned mining settlement, circling to approach from the north, where the terrain offered better concealment. From a ridgeline overlooking the small collection of weathered buildings, they observed the camp's layout, noting guard positions and patterns of movement. 6 buildings, Running Wolf whispered, pointing to each in turn. Main house where Weber stays, bunkhouse for men, stable for horses, 2 storage sheds, small cabin at edge for guard. Activity in the camp suggested at least 8 men present, with 2 visible on guard duty, 1 near the main house and another patrolling between buildings. The rest appeared to be gathered in the bunkhouse, where light and occasional laughter spilled from crude windows. "Wait for deeper darkness," Running Wolf advised. "Men drink after day's work. Guards grow less careful as night passes." As they settled in to wait, Margaret felt a strange calm replace her earlier apprehension. The months of solitary survival, followed by Running Wolf's intensive training, had transformed her from a frightened child into something else. Not quite a warrior, but no longer merely a victim. Whatever happened in the coming hours, she would face it not with paralyzing fear, but with the focused awareness Running Wolf had cultivated in her. The medicine stone pendant hung warm against her skin beneath her jacket, a tangible reminder of the unlikely alliance that had brought her to this moment. From the hidden cave, where she had spent months in isolating fear, to the precipice of direct action against those who had destroyed her family, the journey seemed both impossible and inevitable. As full darkness settled over the mountains and the sounds from the bunkhouse grew more boisterous, Running Wolf touched her shoulder lightly. "Time," he said simply. Together, they began their careful descent toward the raiders' camp, moving like shadows through the moonlit snow. The mission before them carried enormous risk, but also the first real possibility of justice, not just for themselves, But for all those who had fallen victim to Weber's calculated violence, what neither could anticipate was how their careful plan would collide with unexpected developments already in motion within the camp below. Developments that would transform their mission of evidence gathering into something far more dangerous and consequential than either had imagined. Moonlight transformed the snow-covered landscape into a terrain of silver and shadow as Margaret and Running Wolf made their careful approach toward the abandoned mining settlement. They moved in stages, using each patch of darkness as a temporary sanctuary before advancing to the next. The temperature had dropped sharply after sunset, their breath forming crystalline clouds that dissipated in the frigid air. Despite her training over the past days, Margaret found herself struggling to match Running Wolf's fluid stealth. Where he seemed to merge with the environment, she remained painfully conscious of each footfall, each adjustment of weight that might create a telltale sound. Yet the wilderness skills she had developed during her months of solitary survival served her well enough to maintain the necessary silence. They paused at the edge of the clearing that separated the forest from the settlement, concealed behind a snowdrift that had accumulated against a stand of pines. From this vantage point, they had a clear view of the entire camp, 6 buildings arranged in a rough semicircle around what had once been the center of a mining operation. "Guard by stable drunk," Running Wolf whispered, indicating a figure who leaned heavily against a post, occasionally taking swigs from a bottle. "Main house still has light. Weber is awake." "Where do we look first?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. Running Wolf pointed to a small structure at the far edge of the camp. "Storage shed. Raiders keep stolen goods there before taking to traders." He studied the layout once more, then pointed to a narrow path that wound between snowdrifts and the shadow of the bunkhouse. "That way keeps us hidden the longest." With a final check to ensure no one had emerged from the other buildings, they began their approach, moving from one pool of darkness to the next. The sounds from the bunkhouse, drunken laughter, the occasional burst of argumentative voices, provided useful cover for their careful advance. They had nearly reached the storage shed when the bunkhouse door suddenly banged open, spilling yellow lamplight across the snow. Margaret and Running Wolf froze instantly, pressing themselves against the wall of a nearby building as 2 men emerged, weaving slightly from the effects of alcohol. "Weber wants the prisoner ready to move by morning," one man slurred to the other. "Says we need to get the Injun to the Jenkins settlement before the marshal starts poking around Helena." "Waste of time keeping him alive this long," the second man complained. "Should have just killed him with the others at the hunting camp." Margaret felt Running Wolf tense beside her, his body going rigid at the mention of a captured Cheyenne. The men continued past their hiding place, heading toward what appeared to be a root cellar partially built into a hillside, a structure they hadn't noticed during their earlier surveillance. Once the men disappeared inside, Running Wolf turned to Margaret, his expression transformed by unexpected hope and renewed urgency. "My cousin," he whispered, "Yellow Hawk, thought killed with others, must be a prisoner." Their mission had suddenly become more complex. No longer simply gathering evidence, they now faced the moral imperative of rescuing a captive who might be the only other survivor of the Cheyenne massacre. Yet attempting a rescue would dramatically increase the danger they faced. "The storage shed is still our best option," Margaret reasoned, thinking quickly. "If we find evidence first, we'll have a better chance of freeing your cousin and getting away safely." Running Wolf visibly struggled with the impulse to rush immediately to his kinsman's aid, but ultimately nodded in agreement. "Wisdom before action," he acknowledged grimly. "Evidence first, then rescue." They continued toward the storage shed, reaching it without further incident. The crude wooden door was secured with a simple metal latch rather than a lock. The raiders, apparently confident in their isolation and the deterrent effect of armed guards. Running Wolf lifted the latch carefully, easing the door open just enough for them to slip inside. The interior was dark and cluttered. Smelling of dust, leather, and gunpowder, Running Wolf produced a small bundle of pine needles from his pouch, lighting it to create a makeshift torch that cast just enough illumination to navigate without being visible from outside. The shed contained an astonishing array of plundered goods: rifles stacked against one wall, crates of ammunition, saddlebags bulging with unidentified contents, even women's jewelry piled carelessly in a wooden box. "Look for things from your wagon train," Running Wolf directed, as they began carefully searching through the stolen items. "Something you recognize." Margaret moved methodically among the plunder, examining each item for any connection to the Emerson family or the other settlers of the Hollister wagon train. Much of it meant nothing to her, anonymous valuables that could have come from any homestead or settlement. Then, half buried beneath a stack of furs, she spotted something that stopped her heart: a silver pocket watch with distinctive engravings that had belonged to Mr. Hollister, the wagon train's leader. "This was his," she whispered, holding it up. "He showed it to me the night before the attack, said it had been in his family for 3 generations. Running Wolf nodded approvingly, tucking the watch into his pouch. "Good evidence. Shows raiders at Wagon Massacre." He continued searching, eventually uncovering a beaded medicine bag whose craftsmanship he immediately recognized. "This belonged to Singing Bird, my brother's wife, made by her own hands for healing ceremonies." The discovery of items from both massacres provided the concrete connection they had been seeking, proof that the same men were responsible for attacks on both settlers and Cheyenne. It wasn't merely circumstantial evidence, but physical objects that could be identified by survivors and witnesses from both communities. As they prepared to leave the storage shed, Margaret noticed a leather-bound ledger partially concealed beneath. A saddle. Curious, she extracted it carefully and opened its pages in the dim light of the pine torch. "Running Wolf," she whispered urgently, "look at this." The book contained detailed records of the raiders' activities, dates, locations, types of attacks, valuables taken, and most importantly, names of officials who had received portions of the stolen goods. Governor's aides, Indian agents, even a federal marshal's deputy, all were implicated in the conspiracy. "This proves everything," Margaret breathed, stunned by the scope of the corruption revealed. Not just the attacks, but who was behind them. Running. Wolf's expression hardened as he scanned the damning evidence. "More important than what we hoped to find," he agreed. "Shows all corrupt men, not just raiders." He carefully secured the ledger in his pouch alongside the other evidence. "Now free Yellowhawk." They exited the storage shed as cautiously as they had entered, ensuring the latch was exactly as they'd found it. The night had grown colder, the sounds from the bunkhouse diminishing as more of the raiders succumbed to drunken sleep. Only the main house still showed lights, and the guard by the stable had slumped to a sitting position, his chin resting on his chest. Moving with renewed purpose, they approached the root cellar where Yellowhawk was apparently being held. Unlike the storage shed, this structure featured a heavy padlock securing the doors, a clear indication of its importance to the raiders. Running Wolf examined it with a tracker's careful attention. "2 guards inside," he whispered, indicating faint shadows visible through cracks in the wooden doors. "Must draw them out." They retreated to discuss strategy, eventually developing a plan that balanced the urgency of rescue with the crucial importance of preserving the evidence they had acquired. Margaret would create a distraction near the bunkhouse, noisy enough to draw attention, but not so alarming as to rouse the entire camp. While the guards investigated, Running Wolf would overpower them and free his cousin. "If anything goes wrong," Running Wolf instructed, pressing the pouch containing the evidence into Margaret's hands, "you run. Get to Marshal Hanson with this. Promise." Margaret hesitated, reluctant to leave him behind, but ultimately nodded. The evidence they had gathered was too important to risk losing. It represented justice, not just for their families, but for all victims of Weber's schemes. With the plan established, they separated. Margaret circled toward the bunkhouse while Running Wolf positioned himself near the root cellar, bow ready, waiting for her signal. When she reached a woodpile stacked against the bunkhouse wall, Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. With deliberate force, she toppled several logs from the pile, creating a thunderous clatter in the quiet night. Then she quickly retreated to the shadows, circling back toward the agreed-upon position where she could observe the results of her diversion. The effect was immediate. The bunkhouse door flew open, and several men emerged, cursing and fumbling for weapons. More significantly, the root cellar doors opened, and two guards stepped out, rifles ready, looking toward the commotion. Running Wolf moved with the speed and precision of a striking hawk. Before the guards could comprehend what was happening, one fell to a precisely placed arrow, while Running Wolf closed the distance to the second man with astonishing quickness, his hunting knife finding its mark before a warning could be raised. Margaret watched with a mixture of awe and horror. The violence was efficient, necessary, yet it marked a profound difference between them. Running Wolf had been shaped by a lifetime of warfare and survival, while she remained a child thrust into circumstances that demanded adult brutality. No time for such reflections. Running Wolf was already disappearing into the root cellar. Margaret maintained her position, watching anxiously as the men from the bunkhouse investigated the fallen woodpile, apparently attributing the disturbance to nothing more than poor stacking and the effects of melting snow. Long minutes passed before Running Wolf emerged from the cellar, supporting a second figure who moved with evident pain and difficulty. Even from a distance, Margaret could see that Yellowhawk had suffered severe mistreatment during his captivity. His face was bruised, one arm held awkwardly against his body, suggesting broken ribs or worse. The pair made their way slowly toward the rendezvous point, using the shadows cast by buildings to remain concealed from the raiders who had begun to return to the bunkhouse. Satisfied that no threat existed, Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding as Running Wolf and his cousin finally reached her position. Yellowhawk's condition was worse than she had initially assessed. Beyond the visible injuries, he seemed feverish, his breathing labored and irregular. He regarded Margaret with confusion, clearly struggling to comprehend why a white child with a painted face accompanied his rescuer. "Friend," Running Wolf explained simply in Cheyenne, then switched to English for Margaret's benefit. "Yellowhawk weak from beating. Weber wanted information about Cheyenne winter camp." "Did he tell them?" Margaret asked, concerned about potential attacks on Running Wolf's people. Yellowhawk understood enough English to respond directly, though his voice emerged as little more than a pained whisper. "Told nothing," he rasped. "Would die first." The pride and determination in those simple words struck Margaret powerfully. Here was a man who had endured torture rather than betray his people, the same people her own society dismissed as savages lacking civilized values. Their escape route now complicated by Yellowhawk's condition, they began the difficult process of withdrawing from the settlement. Progress was agonizingly slow, with Running Wolf supporting much of his cousin's weight, while maintaining vigilant awareness of potential pursuit. Margaret led the way, employing the techniques Running Wolf had taught her to identify the safest path through the snow-covered terrain. They had covered perhaps a quarter-mile when shouts erupted from the camp behind them. The missing prisoner had been discovered. Moments later, a shot rang out, the bullet whining harmlessly past them into the forest. "They follow tracks in snow," Running Wolf said grimly. "Cannot outrun with injured Yellowhawk." The tactical reality was clear. Burdened by a wounded man, they couldn't hope to escape raiders on horseback, especially through deep snow that preserved their trail in unmistakable detail. They needed an alternative strategy, immediately. "The ridge," Margaret suggested, pointing toward a rocky outcropping. that rose above the tree line. If we can reach higher ground, maybe we can defend a position until daylight. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it offered better prospects than being ridden down in open terrain. They altered course, ascending toward the ridge with desperate urgency, as more shouts indicated the raiders had organized a pursuit. Yellow Hawk struggled visibly with each step, but maintained a stoic silence, refusing to become the liability that doomed them all. The climb was treacherous, the slope steep and partially iced over beneath its covering of snow. Multiple times, Margaret lost her footing, saved from falling only by grabbing at exposed roots or rock outcroppings. Behind them, lights appeared among the trees, lanterns carried by the pursuing raiders, moving with the speed of men familiar with the territory, and unencumbered by a wounded companion. When they finally reached the ridge, Running Wolf quickly assessed their position. One side featured a sheer drop, creating a natural barrier against approach. The other side, while steep, could be ascended by determined pursuers. A cluster of boulders near the precipice offered limited cover, their best option for a defensive position. "Margaret," Running Wolf said urgently, as they settled Yellow Hawk in the most protected spot among the rocks, "you have evidence. Must get to Marshal Hanson." She stared at him in disbelief. "I'm not leaving you." "Not asking," he replied with quiet authority. "On the other side of the ridge, path leads down to the eastern valley. Follow until it reaches the river, then north. To Helena, find Hanson." Margaret shook her head firmly. "We stay together. That was our plan." "Plan changes when situation changes," Running Wolf countered, checking his remaining arrows. "Just 4 after the encounter with the guards." "Yellow Hawk cannot travel faster. Someone must hold raiders here, give you time to escape with evidence." The logic was undeniable, yet Margaret rebelled against it. After months of isolation, then forming this unlikely alliance, the prospect of abandoning Running Wolf and Yellow Hawk to face the raiders alone seemed unthinkable. Yellow Hawk, despite his weakened state, grasped the situation clearly. "Go, young one," he urged, his dark eyes intense despite the pain etched in his features. "What we die for means nothing if truth dies with us." The approaching lights grew closer, accompanied now by voices calling to each other as the raiders coordinated their pursuit. Time had run out for debate or alternatives. Running Wolf pressed something into Margaret's hand, a small bone whistle carved with intricate designs. "My son made this before joining the ancestors," he said softly. "Blow 3 times if in danger. Spirit helpers will come." Margaret recognized the gesture for what it was. Not a practical tool, but a talisman meant to provide comfort, to maintain connection even in separation. She closed her fingers around it, throat tight with emotions she couldn't express. "I'll find Hanson," she promised. "I'll bring help." Running Wolf nodded once, satisfied. "Follow the eastern path. Do not stop until you reach Helena." With a final glance at the 2 warriors positioned among the boulders, Margaret slipped away into the darkness, following the narrow path that wound down the opposite side of the ridge. Behind her, she heard Running Wolf call out in Cheyenne, deliberately, revealing his position to focus the raiders' attention away from her escape route. The path descended steeply, requiring her full concentration to navigate safely in the darkness. Only when she reached the tree line below did Margaret pause to look back. The ridge stood silhouetted against the night sky, tiny pinpoints of light showing where the raiders' lanterns converged on Running Wolf's position. A shot echoed across the valley. Then another. The confrontation had begun. Margaret turned away, forcing herself to focus on the mission now entrusted solely to her. The pouch containing their precious evidence hung heavy around her neck, a physical reminder of the responsibility she carried. Running Wolf and Yellow Hawk were buying time with their lives. She couldn't waste it. Moving with determined purpose, she followed the path as it wound through the winter forest. The physical demands of the journey paradoxically provided relief from the emotional turmoil of leaving her companions behind. Each difficult step, each careful navigation of treacherous terrain required complete attention, leaving no room for a doubt or regret. Dawn found her miles from the ridge, following the course of a half-frozen river that Running Wolf had indicated would lead eventually to Helena. The rising sun revealed a harsh but beautiful landscape. Mountains behind her, rolling foothills ahead, the river a silver ribbon cutting through valleys still deep in winter's embrace. Margaret paused briefly to rest and drink from a spot where flowing water had broken through the ice. As she knelt by the river's edge, a distant sound reached her, the rhythmic drumming of approaching horses moving at a steady trot rather than a gallop. Not the frantic pursuit of raiders, but the measured pace of travelers with legitimate business. Wary but recognizing potential salvation, Margaret moved to a position where she could observe without being immediately seen. The riders appeared around a bend in the trail that paralleled the river. 6 men, in the distinctive attire of lawmen, led by a figure whose bearing marked him immediately as a man of authority. For a wild moment, Margaret considered retreating into the forest. After months of isolation followed by days in Running Wolf's company, the prospect of approaching unknown white men triggered instinctive caution. Yet logic prevailed. These men represented her best hope of obtaining help for Running Wolf and Yellow Hawk, assuming they still lived. Decision made, Margaret stepped into view, raising her hands to show she carried no weapon. The riders reined in sharply, hands moving reflexively towards sidearms, before registering that the figure before them was merely a child, albeit one with a face still partially covered in Cheyenne hunting paint. "Help me!" Margaret called, her voice cracking from cold and exhaustion. "Please, I'm Margaret Emerson. I survived the Hollister Wagon train massacre." The leader dismounted, approaching her with cautious concern. He was a tall man with a graying beard and eyes that had seen enough of the frontier's harshness to recognize authentic desperation when confronted with it. "I'm Marshal Hanson," he said, studying her with evident bewilderment. "We've been investigating. Reports of a survivor for months. Where have you been, child?" Margaret took a deep breath, marshalling her thoughts. Everything depended on conveying the urgency of their situation clearly and convincingly. "Hiding in the mountains," she answered. "Then, with a Cheyenne scout named Running Wolf, we found evidence about who really attacked the wagon train and a Cheyenne hunting camp. The same men did both, trying to start a war between settlers and Indians." Hanson's expression shifted from confusion to focused attention. "What men?" he asked sharply. "James Weber and his raiders," Margaret replied, withdrawing the ledger from the pouch. "It's all in here. Names, dates, who they paid off in the territorial government. And there's more. Weber's planning another attack on the Jenkins settlement, making it look like Cheyenne retaliation." The marshal took the ledger, quickly scanning its contents. His weathered face hardened as he absorbed the implications of what he was reading. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "Running Wolf and I took it from Weber's camp last night," Margaret explained. "We rescued another Cheyenne prisoner too, Yellow Hawk, but the raiders followed us. Running Wolf and Yellow Hawk stayed behind at a ridge west of here to hold them off while I brought you the evidence." Hanson exchanged glances with his deputies, suddenly all business. "Johnson, take the girl back to Helena," he ordered. "The rest of you with me." He turned back to Margaret. "Can you show my deputy where to find this ridge on a map?" Margaret nodded gratefully, exhaustion and relief washing over her in equal measure. "They're outnumbered," she said urgently. "At least 8 raiders against 2 wounded men." "We'll ride hard," Hanson assured her, already remounting his horse. "Johnson, get her safe to town, then bring her statement to Judge Wilson directly, no one else." As 5 of the riders departed at a gallop, following Margaret's directions toward the ridge where she had left Running Wolf and Yellow Hawk, the deputy named Johnson helped her onto his horse. The events of the past 24 hours crashed down on her at once. The infiltration of the raiders' camp, the discovery of Yellow Hawk, the desperate flight and separation from Running Wolf. "They saved my life," she told Johnson as they turned. Toward Helena. "Everyone thinks the Cheyenne are savages, but they saved me. And now they might die for it." The deputy regarded her with thoughtful eyes. "Judge Wilson's been investigating corruption in the territory for months," he said. "That ledger you brought, it could change everything." Margaret touched the bone whistle Running Wolf had given her, still clutched in her hand like a talisman. "I hope that's enough," she whispered, more to herself than to Johnson. "I hope that's worth what it cost." As the horse carried her away from the mountains that had been both her prison and her salvation, Margaret Emerson confronted the uncertainty of what awaited her in the world of white settlements and legal justice, a world that suddenly seemed as foreign to her as the Cheyenne camp might have once appeared. Behind her, the fate of Running Wolf and Yellow Hawk hung in the balance, dependent on whether Marshal Hanson's party could reach them in time. Ahead lay the challenge of convincing a territory accustomed to viewing natives as enemies that this time the real enemy wore a familiar face, and that justice required acknowledging uncomfortable truths about who had truly been the predator and who the prey on this blood-soaked frontier. Helena sprawled across a series of low hills, its buildings a curious mixture of frontier rawness and emerging permanence. Log structures stood alongside more ambitious edifices of stone and milled lumber, testament to the territory's rapid transition from wilderness outpost to established settlement. To Margaret, who had spent the last 3 months in the isolation of mountain wilderness, the town appeared overwhelming, too large, too crowded, too loud with the cacophony of human commerce and conversation. Johnson led her directly to the territorial courthouse, a dignified 2-story building of red brick that stood apart from the more haphazard construction surrounding it. Inside, they were immediately shown to Judge Wilson's chambers, a book-lined room whose atmosphere of quiet authority reminded Margaret with unexpected poignancy of her father's study in their Boston home. Judge Wilson himself proved to be a surprise. Not the stern, forbidding figure Margaret had anticipated, but a man of perhaps 60 with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners and a gentle manner that put her instantly at ease. After Deputy Johnson made brief introductions and excused himself to return to his duties, the judge studied Margaret thoughtfully. "You've been through quite an ordeal, Miss Emerson," he observed, his voice carrying the cultivated tones of Easton. "Education softened by years on the frontier. Perhaps you'd care for some hot chocolate before we begin our discussion. My clerk does exceptionally well." The unexpected kindness nearly undid Margaret's composure. After months of bare survival, followed by days of tension and danger, such a simple comfort seemed almost unreal. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak without her voice breaking. While they waited for the promised refreshment, Judge Wilson asked only the most basic questions about her identity and connection to the Hollister wagon train. He made no demand for her immediate testimony, nor did he press her about the Cheyenne painting still visible on her face, despite her attempts to wash it off at the river. Instead, he allowed her to acclimate gradually to her surroundings, recognizing, perhaps, that the transition from wilderness to civilization required adjustment. Only after Margaret had consumed most of a mug of rich hot chocolate, accompanied by a plate of simple biscuits that nonetheless seemed like extravagant luxury, did the judge broach the subject of her experiences. "Marshal Hanson sent word ahead about the evidence you provided," he said, indicating the ledger that now lay on his desk. "I've reviewed it briefly, and I must say it's the most comprehensive documentation we've seen of the corruption plaguing this territory." He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but gentle. "Would you be willing to tell me your story, Margaret? All of it, from the beginning?" Margaret set down her mug carefully, gathering her thoughts. "Over the past months, She had relived the Wagon train massacre countless times in nightmares and waking memories alike, but had never spoken of it aloud. Finding the words now seemed both necessary and impossibly difficult. I was gathering kindling. She began hesitantly, then found her voice strengthening as the narrative unfolded. She described the attack in clinical detail, the initial gunshots, her concealment in the tall grass, the clear view she had of the raiders removing native disguises after completing their bloody work. Judge Wilson listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing beyond attentive concern. Only when Margaret described her months of solitary survival in the mountain cave did he betray a flicker of surprise, clearly reassessing the child before him in light of such extraordinary resilience. When she reached the part of her story involving Running Wolf, Margaret found herself speaking with increasing passion, determined to convey not just the facts of their alliance, but the deeper understanding it had fostered. "He could have captured me or killed me," she emphasized. "Instead, he taught me to survive better. He showed me how our families were victims of the same men. And when we found evidence against Weber, he stayed behind to give me a chance to escape with it." Her voice faltered slightly. "I don't know if he's still alive." "Marshal Hanson is a capable lawman," Judge Wilson assured her. "If your Cheyenne friends could be helped, he will have found a way." The judge's use of the word friends rather than savages, or even the more neutral natives, wasn't lost on Margaret. It suggested a perspective less tainted by the prejudices that dominated territorial relations. Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent knock. The door opened to reveal Deputy Johnson, his expression betraying barely contained excitement. "Marshal Hanson has returned, Your Honor," he announced, "with prisoners and witnesses." Margaret's heart leaped. Could Running Wolf have survived the confrontation at the ridge? She rose instinctively, only to be gently directed back to her seat by Judge Wilson. "The Marshal will join us shortly," he promised. "Best to remain here where it's quiet for now." The next hour stretched interminably as Margaret waited, alternating between hope and dread. Judge Wilson used the time to take her formal statement, recording her testimony in precise detail with particular attention to identifying features of the raiders and specific statements she had overheard. Though the process was exhausting, Margaret recognized its importance. Her words were being transformed from memory into legal evidence. When Marshal Hanson finally entered the chamber, Margaret scanned his face anxiously for any indication of Running Wolf's fate. The Marshal's expression, typically stoic, softened slightly as he registered her concern. "Your Cheyenne friends are alive, Miss Emerson," he said without preamble. "Wounded, but alive. The older one, Yellow Hawk, has been taken to the missionary hospital. The younger one refused treatment until he knew you were safe." Relief flooded through Margaret with such force that she had to grip the arms of her chair to steady herself. "And Weber?" she asked. "His men?" "5 captured, including Weber himself," Hanson reported, his satisfaction evident despite his professional demeanor. 2 dead in the confrontation. 1 escaped, but won't get far. I've got men watching every trail out of the territory." The Marshal turned to Judge Wilson, his expression shifting to controlled anger. "The evidence in that ledger checks out, Your Honor. We found corresponding documents in Weber's quarters, including letters from 3 territorial officials authorizing payments for what they called special services. There's also correspondence with a Colonel Parker at Fort Ellis, arranging for military response to be deliberately delayed after reported Indian attacks." Judge Wilson's face hardened as he absorbed the implications. "A conspiracy of this magnitude will require federal intervention," he concluded. "I'll telegraph the War Department and Justice Department immediately." He glanced at Margaret. "Your testimony will be crucial, Miss Emerson, as will that of the Cheyenne survivors." "Running Wolf," Margaret said urgently. "I need to see him." Hanson and Wilson exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, the judge nodded, "Deputy Johnson will escort you to him," he said. "He's being held in a secure room at the sheriff's office, not as a prisoner," he added hastily, seeing Margaret's expression darken. "But for his own protection. There are many in Helena who would react poorly to a Cheyenne warrior in their midst, especially one painted for battle." The realization that Running Wolf might face danger even within the supposed safety of the settlement hadn't occurred to Margaret. Her months in his company had so thoroughly altered her perception that she had forgotten how deeply ingrained anti-native sentiment remained among white settlers. "He saved my life," she said firmly, "multiple times. He deserves to be treated with respect." "And he will be," Judge Wilson assured her. "Marshal Hanson and I will see to it personally." Deputy Johnson led Margaret through back streets to avoid curious onlookers, though her appearance still drew startled glances from those they passed. The deputy had found her a clean dress and warm coat from the church's charity stores, but her wilderness-hardened appearance and residual face paint marked her as something outside normal experience, even in a frontier town accustomed to unusual sights. The sheriff's office occupied the ground floor of a sturdy stone building that also housed the territorial jail. Johnson escorted Margaret past the front desk, where a surprised deputy started to object before recognizing his colleague. "Judge Wilson's orders," Johnson explained curtly. "The girl sees the Cheyenne. No arguments." They proceeded down a narrow hallway to a room typically used for interviewing witnesses. Johnson knocked once, then unlocked the door, standing aside to allow Margaret to enter. Running Wolf sat on a simple wooden chair, his posture upright despite the bandages visible beneath his buckskin shirt. His face remained impassive as the door opened, but when he recognized Margaret, something in his expression shifted, a subtle softening around the eyes that constituted profound emotion by his stoic standards. "Young one," he greeted her, rising despite what must have been considerable pain. "You found the marshal." Margaret crossed the room in 3 quick steps and, abandoning any pretense of frontier toughness, wrapped her arms around him in a fierce embrace. Running Wolf stood momentarily stunned by the unrestrained display of emotion, then awkwardly returned the gesture, patting her back with uncharacteristic gentleness. "You're alive," Margaret managed, her voice muffled against his chest. "I was afraid." "Takes more than raiders to kill Cheyenne Scout," Running Wolf interrupted, a hint of humor in his voice. He eased back, studying her face with approval. "You did well. Marshall came in time. Yellowhawk will live." Margaret recounted her encounter with Hanson's party and subsequent journey to Helena, while Running Wolf described the confrontation at the ridge, how he and Yellowhawk had managed to hold the raiders at bay until dawn, when the marshals, approaching riders, had forced Weber to divide his attention, creating the opportunity for Running Wolf to turn defense into counterattack. "Weber tried to escape," Running Wolf explained, satisfaction evident in his tone. "Put an arrow in his leg, not enough to kill, enough to slow until the marshal caught him." Their private reunion was interrupted by the arrival of Judge Wilson and Marshal Hanson, the latter carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The judge pulled a chair close to Running Wolf, addressing him with the same respect he had shown Margaret. "Mr. Wolf," he began, using the anglicized version of the Cheyenne name, "I want to personally thank you for your courage in protecting Miss Emerson and gathering evidence against Weber and his conspirators." Running Wolf acknowledged the thanks with a dignified nod, but remained watchful, clearly unaccustomed to such treatment from white authorities. "The Marshal and I have been discussing how best to proceed with this case," Wilson continued. "The implications reach far beyond territorial jurisdiction. I've sent telegrams to Washington requesting federal intervention, but until that arrives, we face certain practical challenges." "Weber's friends in government," Running Wolf surmised, his perception cutting straight to the core issue. "Exactly," Hanson confirmed grimly. 3 territorial officials are implicated by the ledger, including the assistant governor. They have resources, influence, and motivation to suppress this evidence by any means necessary. The unstated implication hung in the air. Both Margaret and Running Wolf represented significant threats to powerful men who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate such threats permanently. "What happens now?" Margaret asked, unconsciously moving closer. To Running Wolf, Judge Wilson sighed heavily. "Ideally, both of you would remain under protection until federal authorities arrive to take formal testimony. However, given the extent of the corruption we've uncovered, I'm not confident we can guarantee your safety even in official custody." "Can't trust all deputies," Running Wolf observed matter-of-factly. "Some take money from bad men." "Unfortunately, yes," Hansen admitted, "which leaves us with limited options." He unwrapped the oilcloth bundle, revealing Margaret's father's Bible, Hollister's silver watch, and the Cheyenne medicine bag they had recovered from Weber's storage shed. "We've documented these as evidence, but thought you should have them back." Margaret accepted the Bible with trembling hands, opening it to the page where her family's births had been recorded in her father's careful script. The tangible connection to her past life brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "I've been considering alternatives," Judge Wilson said, returning to the pressing matter of their safety. "There's a ranch south of here, belonging to a former judge, named Hartford. He's a good man, trustworthy, with enough hands to keep his property secure. He could offer temporary sanctuary until federal marshals arrive from Washington." Running Wolf considered this, then shook his head. "Must return to my people," he said firmly. "Yellow Hawk too, when strong enough. Cheyenne need warning about corrupt officials, preparation if soldiers come." Hansen and Wilson exchanged concerned glances. "The territory is still dangerous for you," the marshal pointed out. "Weber's remaining men, his allies in government, they'll be looking for revenge." "Always danger," Running Wolf replied with philosophical acceptance. "Better to face my people than hide in white man's ranch." A new voice entered the conversation. From the doorway, "Perhaps there's a third option." All heads turned to see a man in his early 40s, dressed in the practical attire of a frontier professional rather than a laborer or rancher. His weathered face suggested significant time outdoors, but his bearing and speech marked him as educated. "Dr. Thomas Lawrence," he introduced himself, nodding respectfully to each person present. "I work with the Indian Commission in Washington and the Missionary Society." Judge Wilson's expression reflected recognition and cautious approval. "Dr. Lawrence has been documenting relations between settlers and native tribes throughout the territory," he explained. "His reports have been instrumental in shaping more balanced policies." Lawrence stepped fully into the room, his manner direct, but unthreatening. "I couldn't help overhearing your dilemma," he said, "and I believe I can offer a solution that might satisfy all concerned." He addressed Running Wolf directly, with none of the condescension that typically characterized white interactions with natives. "I'm traveling to the northern Cheyenne winter camp in 3 days to deliver medical supplies and conduct diplomatic discussions. You and Yellow Hawk could accompany my party. We have armed escorts commissioned directly by the federal government, not territorial authorities." Running Wolf's expression remained neutral, though Margaret detected a flicker of interest in his eyes. "And the girl?" he asked, indicating Margaret with a slight movement of his head. Dr. Lawrence turned his attention to her, his expression softening. "That depends on Miss Emerson's wishes," he replied. "Judge Wilson mentioned you have relatives in Oregon. We could arrange safe passage once federal authorities have taken your testimony." The prospect of being separated from Running Wolf struck Margaret with unexpected force. After months of isolation, followed by their intense partnership, the thought of returning to conventional white society, even with family, seemed both foreign and somehow inadequate. "What if I went with you?" she asked impulsively. "To the Cheyenne camp." The suggestion clearly startled all the adults present, though. Running Wolf's reaction was characteristically subdued, merely a slight raising of eyebrows. "Margaret," Judge Wilson began gently, "while I understand you've formed a bond with Mr. Wolf during your ordeal, returning to civilization, to your own people, would surely be better for your long-term well-being." "The judge is right, Hanson. Agreed. You've shown remarkable courage and adaptability, but a Cheyenne winter camp is no place for a white child." Dr. Lawrence, however, studied Margaret with more thoughtful consideration. "Actually," he said slowly, "there might be practical advantages to such an arrangement, at least temporarily." He elaborated on his thinking. Margaret's unique position as a witness to both the Wagon train massacre and the subsequent events made her a valuable bridge between cultures. Her presence in the Cheyenne camp, under appropriate supervision, could demonstrate to both communities that cooperation was possible. Moreover, it would place her beyond the reach of Weber's remaining allies, while federal authorities organized a formal investigation. It wouldn't be permanent, Lawrence emphasized, addressing both Margaret and the concerned officials. Just until the immediate danger has passed and proper arrangements can be made for her future. Running Wolf, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "Girl has earned a place of honor among Cheyenne," he said simply, "showed courage of warrior, wisdom of elder, would be welcomed by my people." His uncharacteristically direct endorsement clearly swayed Lawrence's thinking. Judge Wilson and Marshal Hanson remained hesitant, but gradually acknowledged the practical merits of the arrangement, particularly given the limited alternatives for ensuring Margaret's safety. "We would need your guardian's consent," Wilson pointed out. "Your uncle in Oregon?" "Uncle Matthew barely knew me," Margaret interrupted. "He met me once when I was 5 years old. He's my father's half-brother, and only agreed to let us join him because father had carpentry skills he needed for his lumber business." The judge sighed, recognizing the complexity of the situation. "I'll document this as a temporary arrangement. For your protection as a material witness," he decided, "with regular checks on your welfare by Dr. Lawrence or his associates." 3 days later, Margaret stood at the edge of Helena, watching as Dr. Lawrence's party made final preparations for departure. The expedition consisted of 2 wagons loaded with medical supplies and trade goods, 6 armed guards commissioned by the Indian Commission, Lawrence himself, and a translator familiar with several native languages. Yellow Hawk had been deemed well enough to travel, though he would ride in one of the wagons until his strength returned fully. Running Wolf, despite his own injuries, insisted on riding, presenting an image of Cheyenne dignity that would be important when they reached his people's camp. Margaret had spent the intervening days providing detailed testimony about the massacre and subsequent events, which Judge Wilson had recorded in exhaustive detail for the federal authorities. She had also received a thorough medical examination that confirmed what she already knew. Months of wilderness survival had left her physically toughened, but dangerously underweight and deficient in several key nutrients. Dr. Lawrence had prescribed a regimen to gradually restore her health, emphasizing that her body needed time to readjust to regular varied nutrition. More challenging was the psychological adjustment to human society after months of isolation. Margaret found herself overwhelmed by crowds, uncomfortable in enclosed spaces, and startled by sudden movements or loud noises, reactions that Lawrence assured her were normal after such experiences. Now dressed in practical frontier clothing that represented a compromise between white society's expectations and the demands of winter travel, Margaret took a final look at Helena. The town had offered her first experience of civilization since the massacre, a tentative reintroduction to the human community that had proven both comforting and disconcerting. Running Wolf guided his horse alongside her, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Ready for journey?" he asked simply. Margaret nodded, adjusting the small pack that contained her meager possessions, her father's Bible, a journal provided by Judge Wilson, clothing donated by Helena's church ladies, and a few practical items for the trail. Around her neck hung both Running Wolf's medicine stone and the bone whistle he had given her on the ridge, tangible connections to the partnership that had ultimately saved both their lives. "What will your people think of me?" she asked, voicing the concern that had grown as their departure approached. Running Wolf considered this with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Some will welcome you as a friend who helped bring truth to light," he replied honestly. "Some will see only white face and remember other whites who brought suffering. Most will wait, watch, decide based on your actions, not your blood." It was a fair assessment, free from false reassurance. Margaret appreciated his honesty, one of many qualities she had come to value during their time together. "I have something for you," Running Wolf said unexpectedly, reaching into a small pouch. At his waist, he withdrew an object wrapped in soft deer hide, presenting it to Margaret with formal dignity. Unwrapping the bundle, she found a bracelet of intricately woven horsehair and sinew, decorated with small beads of polished bone and a single eagle. "Feather secured with red thread. Yellow Hawk made this," Running Wolf explained. "Says you earned a warrior's mark by facing enemies without fear, protecting those who could not protect themselves." His normally impassive features softened slightly. "In the Cheyenne way, make you family, not by blood, but by heart." The gift carried meaning beyond its physical form: acceptance, recognition, incorporation into a culture that white society had taught her to fear and disparage. Margaret secured the bracelet around her wrist, understanding the honor it represented. Dr. Lawrence approached, indicating it was time to depart. As Margaret climbed into the wagon seat beside him, she found herself positioned between worlds. No longer the Boston girl who had embarked on a frontier adventure, not yet fully integrated into the Cheyenne community that awaited her, but something new and undefined. The road ahead held uncertainty: the ongoing investigation into Weber's conspiracy, the eventual reunion with her uncle in Oregon, the complex process of healing from trauma. Yet for perhaps the first time since witnessing her family's murder, Margaret felt a sense of purpose, stronger than mere survival. As the wagons lurched into motion, beginning the journey toward the Cheyenne winter camp, Margaret caught Running Wolf's eye. The Cheyenne warrior who had found her half-starved tracks in the snow, who had recognized her strength when she saw only her own weakness, inclined his head in a gesture that conveyed both respect and shared understanding. They had begun as chance, encounters in a wilderness stained by violence, a child survivor hiding in a cave, a warrior seeking justice for his slaughtered kin. They continued now as something else entirely, living bridges between worlds that preferred to remain divided, carriers of truths that demanded acknowledgement, however uncomfortable. The Montana sky stretched vast and clear above them. The mountains, that had been both Margaret's prison and sanctuary, receding slowly behind as they moved toward an uncertain future, one that would be shaped not by the tragedies that had marked them both, but by the unlikely alliance those tragedies had forged. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.